I want to take a minute and stop by the road here on my way to the farm and just show this cornfield, which in an earlier video I talked about spraying down the early cover crops that we planted green into, the cereal rye that was in here, and how it would go through kind of a magical transformation from what looked like a weedy field with no corn and then turn into a pretty nice corn crop. Well, there it is. It actually does look pretty good. Let me flip the camera around and pan around it for you. The headlands look rough here because we did so many passes between side dressing the fertilizer and planting the cover crops, doing the interseeding, that the headlands got pretty beat up in some spots. Some are better than others. Right here is heavily compacted because there's a field road approach, so we've gone in and out of here a lot. This spot always is pretty rough because of the field headland traffic. But you look down a little further and that's looking pretty good over there. The cover crops were terminated right around May, right in that May 17th to 20th time frame. I don't remember the exact date. This is June 28th today. The corn is looking pretty good. I just scouted the field. It does have some ragweed issues. This only got one pass, really. It got the glyphosate to terminate the cover crop and then a 2,4-D amine mix to take care of broadleaf weeds. There are parts of this field that look really, really clean. So despite the fact that we have a few weedy areas, they're pretty concentrated and they're pretty small. And a lot of the field looks really nice and doesn't have a lot of weed pressure. A little bit's there, a little bit's okay. I'm not worried about a little bit of weed pressure. The interseeded cover crops are coming up really nicely. We can step in and take a look at those a little bit closer. You can't really see them from the zoomed out view. But what I want them to do is just start to get established and grow to a certain point, and then the corn will canopy and shade them out, but it won't kill them. The species we've planted will survive in the shade of the corn crop. They just won't flourish. They won't get real big and put on a lot of biomass until after the corn is harvested. All right, I picked a spot here without too much weed pressure so that I don't look too bad for those watching. This is a 4-way mix in this interseeding of annual ryegrass, tillage radish, crimson clover, and bayou kale. It was intended to be seeded at about 20 pounds per acre with the annual ryegrass, and then about 2 pounds per acre each of the other three species in here. I ended up going quite a bit heavier than that. I had some seed from an identical interseeding mix from last year left over. So I ordered enough seed for all of the corn acreage that we have, and then I just mixed in the other seed. I weighed all the bags, got a total weight, and then divided it by the number of acres we have. So this is actually planted at closer to 40 pounds per acre on the annual ryegrass, and probably close to 3 pounds per acre on the other elements, which is a pretty heavy seeding for interseeding. I wanted to do a heavy seeding for interseeding, if possible, just simply because I want that competition in here for the weeds, and I want the biomass that I know that annual ryegrass can build by pumping carbon down into the soil. And these species don't compete heavily with the corn, so they should be able to coexist side by side pretty well even at these heavier planting rates. So those are the reasons I picked and went with that course of action. I would like to diversify our interseeding species even further in the coming years, but this was on a cost share program with our Soil and Water Conservation District, so I was kind of limited in the species I could pick. And you know, when you count the corn in here, that's 5 species, and I suppose when you start counting the annual weeds that are coming up too, you have a pretty good diversity. And what I really wanted to see in the fields was more diversity. I am just sick of seeing monoculture corn and the fact that we're taught that that's the way to grow corn. It's not. We can grow a good corn crop this way too. Any farmers watching this who understand that we went through and only did one post-emerge herbicide application on this without any pre-emerge or any residual, you know that that's a risky move. And I think the really good growing year we're having is showing that the weeds are flourishing too. Our corn crop looks pretty darn good. But you know, along with that, it's a good growing year for the weeds. So part of my plan here is that the corn can tolerate some of the smaller weed pressure, and I'm hoping it'll canopy over here shortly. It's getting really close, and on our big 18-acre field, it's already canopied over pretty good. I am hoping that the corn will canopy over, retard some of the growth of these weeds so that maybe they won't catch up. And then a certain amount of it, if I have a certain amount of crop loss from weeds in here, that's okay. The whole point is to restore the soil, not to get an optimal corn crop every single year. So if we can avoid applying extra herbicides, and we can avoid tillage, and we can kind of let the soil, particularly in this field where the soil organic matter is quite low, if we can start to rebuild that soil organic matter and change that soil chemistry, that's our ultimate goal. The corn crop is secondary to the soil improvement. So if I take you over to the bean field, you can see in the bean field we're going to walk to, that was in corn last year with interseeded cover crops, and it had a lot of weed pressure. Last year with the rain, the corn crop wasn't very good. The interseeded crop, cover crops were really nice, but the field had a lot of weed pressure, and I was worried when we put it into beans this year that we would have a lot of ragweed, we'd have a lot of weed growth, and that it would be hard to control because the beans obviously don't canopy, they don't get as big, they don't shade out the weeds as well as corn does. But I'll show you why I have reason for hope here. Now, by contrast, this soybean field, which was in corn last year with interseeded cover crops, is really clean. Part of that is planting the Enlist soybeans in here that we used this year and being able to spray Enlist Duo. That was able to help us knock out the weed pressure. But this didn't have a ton of weed pressure in it, despite the fact that the corn crop that was in here last year had quite a bit of ragweed in it. And I think the lesson to be taken from that is that interseeded cover crops in corn don't fight the weeds necessarily the year you plant them. What they do is they fight the weeds the next year. Part of the way they change the soil chemistry and the soil biology carries over. It doesn't have an immediate effect because, like right now, you can see the corn, what I keep pointing to is the cornfield, which is right there, that we were just in. Part of what they do when they're brand new is they start to change the soil biology, but they don't do it the year you plant them. So what you're doing when you interseed into a corn crop with a cover crop mix like I've done is you're basically setting yourself up for success next year. That's the way I'm interpreting it. I'm sure there's other cover crop specialists and people who would disagree with me on that or have a different opinion. But that's where I see it, is that you see these benefits over the long term, not in the immediate short term. It's not like going out and using an herbicide where you spray it and within a few days you've got results. Cover crops are a long game. Regenerative agriculture is a long game kind of thing. So you're looking for benefits next year or 2 years down the road or 5 years down the road. And the idea is to develop a system and stick with it, and so that those benefits start to stack up over time as you continue to use cover crops and you continue to maintain a no-till or minimum till. As we're finding, it's pretty difficult for us to be completely no-till, but we're being very, very minimal about the tillage we use. So anyway, the benefits stack up over the long run. So that's kind of my little lesson here today. And this field was in one of my earlier videos where I came out here with a camera and I looked at it, where there was a lot of growth in here. There was a lot of annual ryegrass, a lot of cereal rye, a lot of dandelions. Now after one round of spraying, it's really looking clean. We're not going to spray this again. The beans are going to canopy here before too long, and they'll help shade out the weeds. And whatever it's going to be, it's going to be. And that's kind of the way I'm looking at this cornfield behind me too, is that there's weed pressure in there. Rather than race to try to treat it with something and spend lots of money on another round of spray, we've done enough spraying for that crop. We've kept our input costs really low. We should still be able to get a good harvest out of it, even if there's some ragweed patches in there, even if there's some water hemp. And over time, the cover crop regimen is gonna crowd those weeds out, and it's gonna change the soil biology to the point where it's not as hospitable for those types of broadleaf weeds. So, long game. Rather than jump on it right this minute, we're looking for results in the forthcoming years in a field like that. And to be fair, this year, because we were able to get in early, and assuming, which is a dangerous thing to do, but assuming we have a nice fall where we can get in and harvest at an early date, you better bet that after the success we had in our other bean field, you remember this bean field was not seeded green into cereal rye. It was planted green into whatever was growing here, which was sort of leftover annual ryegrass mostly. The field by our driveway that I've shown you that has the heavy residue in it, that was planted green into cereal rye, and I like the results of that so much that you can bet that next year, or this fall I should say, when we harvest this corn, I am going to come right in here behind the corn picker with the no-till drill and 60 pounds of cereal rye per acre at a minimum. And we are going to seed this heavily in a cover crop so that next spring, when I'm going to put soybeans in here, this will be a lush carpet of cereal rye, helping to choke back and hold back any weeds. This ragweed's going to seed out, and there's not much I can do about that. I mean, every time I come through here, my temptation is to start pulling weeds, and I do. I pull a few, and then I remember that it's futile, that this is too many acres to go through and pull the weeds on, and I'm just wasting my time. So I have to indulge my need to act for a few minutes and get over it. But you know, it's more thinking about that long-term plan rather than try to cure this right now. It's that plan of come in, seed this with cereal rye in the fall, let it get established, hopefully plant it early enough that it gets some growth on in the fall, and then after that, when this field is just a solid mat of cereal rye in the spring, plant next year's soybeans green into that, let that rye help suppress the weeds, knock back some of this this growth, and then use those enlist beans again. That seems to be a really potent tool to keep weeds out of these crops. Part of being a farmer in general and part of being a regenerative farmer, and I talk about this stuff like I know what I'm talking about, but the fact is I'm figuring it out as I go. So when I film this video, I can tell you this is my concrete plan for next year. That plan's probably going to change at some point. I think I've got the foundation of a plan, and it's always important to have that basic end goal in mind and a foundation of how you want to get there, and then be able to change it up if you need to, you know. Every day I try to sit down and learn something new about the tools that I have available to me, whether that's cover crop information, whether that's getting a better understanding of the herbicides that are out there that I can use, figuring out ways to combat the weeds that we've got that are resistant to the more conventional sprays we've used in the past. You know, all of it. It's a learning game constantly. So these are some of the issues. These are some of the problems. Weed pressure mostly is the problem because we're crop farming. And then the plan for how to try to deal with it going forward. And not only that, we can grow a good corn crop while we're building the soil biology back up, increasing the soil microbial health, and build organic matter by growing more biomass. And by having that species diversity and not just having monoculture corn, I can tell you that later on in the summer we'll see all kinds of insects and wildlife in here. I can see it now. There's species in here that normally wouldn't be in the cornfield, just simply because we have the diversity of growth here and not just a sterile corn crop with nothing else going on. So there's value in that too, even if it's not easily monetized. You still have to try to account for the benefit of having a healthy, diverse ecosystem in your crops. Putting a dollar value on that's tough, but I know it's there. So we're gonna just have faith that it's there and go forward with it.